Hi, hello, welcome back. It's me, Devaraj, and today I want to talk a bit about psychosis. Someone left me a message at the bottom of one of my YouTube videos and said, "Hey, can you make a video about psychosis?" And I just thought, "Yeah, man, that's a really good idea." Because having been around the alternative scene a lot and into drugs a lot in my youth, I came to develop sometimes somewhere or other when I became a therapist an understanding of psychosis, and it's like a kind of very simple mental health condition, but it can be really useful to understand it for a couple of reasons. One is, the lesser reason is that if you can understand psychosis from a perspective of body-based psychotherapy, then you can understand a lot of other mental health conditions. And secondarily, what can be very important for people is that understanding psychosis when you've had mental health conditions, or you've had like a psychotic break, or you've had a time when you've really lost it, it can be very, very scary. And the thought that it might happen again, apparently for no trigger or for very little trigger, can be terrifying, and people can really shut down for a long period of time. And if you do understand it, and if you can have it explained to you as to what's happened and what's likely going on inside and what you can do to move forwards and make sure it doesn't happen again, you can feel like the weight really comes off, I speak also here from personal experience. When I was 24, back in the 80s, back in the mid 80s, there was a lot of drugs around, probably still are. I'm not so much in that scene. But acid was big for a while, and there was these big microdots, as used to call them. And I took a load of these once, age 24, and it was a very powerful trip for me, for about the first 3 or 4 hours, what I can remember, because I'm quite a lot older than that now. My mind was expanding and going around the universe everywhere and stuff like this. And then it was like at some point, maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours in, I just hit a wall of it's like rage came into me, like pure fucking killer rage. And it was terrifying. It's like my body was possessed by some evil spirit or something like this. And I could kind of, I felt like I wanted to kill people. I could feel like wanting to hold daggers in my hands. And it scared the shit out of me. It scared the shit out of me. It came on very strong, and it lasted about 2 days, and at some point, maybe, I don't know, 10, 12 hours in, I could see it was wearing down a little bit, and my mind started to not panic so much, because I figured, okay, it's going to wear off, because I thought, fucking hell, I'm going to be like this, they're going to lock me up, they're going to lock me up, or I'm going to fucking kill people, it was very, very powerful feeling inside, and very, very scary. And these days, because often in therapy you end up working with people who've been through stuff that you've been through. It's kind of how it works. You can help them forwards. And I didn't, it did wear off for me. In a couple of days, I was back to normal, and it caused me to shut down a lot. I certainly didn't take any acid anymore, and generally started to steer clear of some of the kind of scenes I was into, which wasn't a bad thing, but it also shut me down a lot, it shut me down a lot, and it probably took me 5-10 years to really kind of open up from that in a way. I kind of retreated a bit into my own world. I didn't have any support. I didn't have any theoretical understanding of what happened. I just knew something fucking scary had happened to me, and I had to make sure it didn't happen again. And when I started to do therapy in groups early on, in fact, I was working with Yosho Humaniversity when I started to attend workshops, as a participant. And I remember there'd often be these sessions, they'd call them like darshan, where you could ask a question of the therapists. And I asked a question of the therapist once, and I told about this experience I had when I was 24. And, that was like 15 years later. I was in my late 30s, early 40s. And the therapist stood up and said, yeah, I don't recommend you take LSD anymore, but you have to own that there's a phenomenal amount of anger trapped inside of you, and just to keep working at it progressively. And so I did this, and I discovered, yeah, inside I was angry as fuck. I knew that, but I never experienced straight on that kind of killer rage come into me so powerfully. I thought I had no mental control over it. That's what happened when I was 24. And so over the years, I developed a real understanding of psychosis and of, drug experiences, kind of experiences. Sometimes people get carted out of Vipassana sessions, there's big Vipassana centres around the place in Devon, Herefordshire, and every now and again they have to take someone away in a straitjacket and shit. And it's very, very scary, because there's not much understanding about these things. So I wanted to go into psychosis a little bit, having just shared a little bit my own experience. And something to understand what we're talking about when we talk about psychosis is that the human mind has changed from, we have normal reference points in life. We got our family, we got our friends, Kevin, Barry, Jane, Seymour, whatever, our mum, our father, we've got people who are our reference points, and we have the society around us, the job we have, and things like this. And, as we call ourselves kind of now normal grounded human beings, to give it a kind of normal category, those, we have common reference points. We all agree, yeah, going to the office, we're going to work, going to see the parents, going to Christmas to hang out with your Uncle Barry or whatever. They're normal things. We understand the relationships between things, and we commonly agree on those. And what happens in psychosis is that a person has gone into their mind, basically, and has reascribed these relationships and is now behaving as though that world in their mind is true. And by that I mean, to give an example, perhaps, you might suddenly come to believe, okay, that your boss, Barry, is actually the king of Sweden who's an evil dictator. Maybe in your mind you could have little ideas about this sometimes when he's telling you off or something and it seems like a bit of a joke. But if you go up into your mind, into this world, and really start behaving as though Barry is the king of Sweden and he's an evil boss from the 7th century or whatever, then you've become psychotic. You might start to believe that your girlfriend is, really, really evil and checking up on you all the time. You start to get paranoid. What happens is, we can often see in those of us who have fantasy life, who have, ideation as they call it, there's times when the mind is idle and we sometimes imagine and fantasize, imagine ourselves to be the most awesome being, or, having the best looking partners or whatever it is, tons of cash and glamour or whatever, pumping our self-image up in our fantasy world. And we also can, fantasize in funny ways, and in a way, there's nothing wrong with that, but it also can be a prelude, in some ways. I don't want to freak people out, okay? It's okay to have fantasies and shit, but it can be a prelude that you can, as an escape route. What happens in psychosis, basically, is that there is something that's triggered inside your overall being. If you haven't got my chalkboard here today, if you consider the whole spectrum of experience like a big circle, I've done this a few times if you're used to my channel, then we tend to live behaviourally in quite a small part of that. And in some of the outer regions of this overall circle of experience, there are scary stuff from our childhood, emotions that got repressed and held in, maybe anger, huge chunks of anger hidden out of our awareness, and we learn to negotiate around them in life, and we're so adept at it we don't realise we're doing it. And if we're triggered into that, defensive mechanisms in the psyche are triggered, are responsively triggered, and we may be shot into our mind and start to inhabit this world of psychosis where relationships are different. And when when you're around people who've had psychotic break, or you've been with someone who's in psychosis, they've gone into this altered world. And the things to understand is they've got altered reference points, and your role as a therapist or friend is to try and bring them back. Something will have triggered them. It may be a clearly external trigger, a traumatic event happening, or older feelings being triggered by something. It may be a drug event. Drugs can expand your awareness, sometimes so fast, like my experience when I was 24, expanded it to a point where it just zoomed into a zone that I was not ready in my normal egoic state to enter. A phenomenal level of anger arising from early stuff that happened in my early childhood. And it was overwhelming. So it may be drug experiences, it may be obvious triggers, it may be something cyclical in the brain chemistry has just made you more vulnerable to go into that area for a while, and it's scary. But the things to understand about psychosis is that there is some form of avoidance in it. In normal human social relationships, we've escaped the world of normal human social relationships, and we've inhabited a weird world in our head where we feel more in control and safer. So if you've got, if you've had psychosis, or if you've, whether it's drug related or trauma related, or it just seemed to come on, you can understand this. There will be stuff in your in your body, basically in your overall spectrum of all the experiences and all the feelings that are inside of you. There's stuff there that you don't want to go into, and you've been moved up there. You've gone into your mind. You've gone into this alternative world, and you're now hanging out there. And if you can find a way to come back, this is good. And if you're a friend of someone who's got psychosis, or parent, or whatever, who's had these episodes, understand that there will be a possibility for them to come back down, but they need to feel safe, basically. It may take a little while, They may need medication for a bit, to loosen their certain drugs, antipsychotic medications. I forget the name of the classic one that they used for a lot of times in the UK, but there's that kind of force for the awareness out of that part of the mind, that holding up in this kind of alternative fantasy world, and you can come back down. They will come back down when they feel safe, and you may be able to encourage them back down, being there for people, not leaving them on their own too much. It's not always easy. It's not always easy, and sometimes medical interventions are needed. Medical interventions, rather, are needed. But we can understand psychosis as essentially a form of extreme avoidant behaviour, and that certain people, their kind of minds may be a bit predisposed towards it, in that not necessarily that they're going to have psychotic episodes, but they tend to live in fantasies quite a lot, because the danger is then, you see, how it kind of is like there's a trigger somewhere in the body, maybe around the heart or the gut, and the awareness goes up into the mind, into the fantasy world. But in a healthy individual, it can just come back down again into the body. But in someone who's triggered and they're determined not to feel what's going on inside, it goes up in there and it stays up there. Tries to shut the door. I'm just going to live in my alternative reality world now, And they've had a psychotic, and that is psychosis. You also see people, just to pick up a couple of little other threads of it, because it's useful to understand this stuff. In meditation, it's quite common. People doing Vipassana, 10-day Vipassana retreats. I was actually just reading a piece by, I think it was in Esquire, men's magazine, Esquire magazine, last month, about some guy, and he was kind of, it wasn't a bad piece, but I didn't think it was so great also. But, he had an experience, you go to a Vipassana retreat, you're on like 10 days, doing 10 hours a day, just sitting there. You can, in your awareness, somewhere enter all sorts of alternative parts of you. Your ego might start to dissolve in some way, but it's too quick for it's too quick for how you can process that at a normal egoic level, and you're splintered out there. It's also a form of psychotic episode. Also, you could access very intense emotions, same thing, doing Vipassana. Another area where, interestingly it relates is if you start to, maybe if you hang out in places where there's a lot of spiritual people, like in the UK, Glastonbury or some places like that, where people are really into channeling and, crystals and fortune-telling kind of stuff, you'll find a lot of people who are living in a kind of slightly alternative proto-psychotic state. They're usually what has happened is that their social wounding has been so strong as a child, they've learned to create a new ego as a kind of spiritual being. To see themselves as a spiritual person, rather than the kind of wounded or fragmented person who was their natural ego that was formed by maybe the traumatic or whatever happened in their childhood. So in many ways, spiritual belief systems can validly be seen as a form of psychosis. The difference is between someone, the crucial difference is not really anything wrong with a belief system, but when someone goes into it and they can't come back down again, it can be problematic. That's when you can start to get problems. In a lot of spiritual schools, and you can take not just kind of Glastonbury, fortune-telling, crystal-gazing stuff, in a lot of spiritual schools, there's a tendency to kind of want to eradicate or do, bad stuff to the ego. The ego is seen as a problem. That's the underlying kind of perspective. But this is certainly not, in my experience of working with the body and being a therapist, the ego is not a problem at all. The ego is basically a good thing, but, we need to deepen our awareness progressively over time. There's nothing wrong with the ego. There's nothing wrong with it. You don't need to get rid of it. People that believe you need to get rid of the ego usually had very traumatic childhoods where on some level someone was really trying to squash their ego, a father, a parent, or in England there's this kind of old school system, it's often called the public schools, where kids are really brutalized to become members of the upper classes later and stuff like that, but their egos are squashed, and sometimes they become Buddhists, because they're attracted to the belief that the ego is wrong, or that's their interpretation of Buddhism. Okay, so I've covered a fair bit. Hopefully it's given you a little bit more insight into psychosis And from this, you can also start to understand many mental health conditions have either a larger or relatively smaller element, which can be understood psychologically as a form of avoidance. That doesn't mean you can always treat these conditions purely with psychology. You may need medication. You may need some form of incarceration restraint. It may be all you can do, you know. Once neural pathways are set up in a certain avoidance condition, they tend to get kind of hardened. And by that I mean if you don't follow straight away, when things are triggered inside of us, you know, as kids we learn different pathways of avoidance. And those pathways tend to get kind of set in stone. It's hard to reprocess that quickly. You know, you can't kind of change that quickly. Once you've learned a certain escape mechanism, you go back there. And likewise, you know, with drug addiction, you need to often avoid certain drug stimuli, you know. Whether it's negative feelings which push you back into the desire to use, or whether it's being around drug paraphernalia or areas where you used to use this kind of thing. You know, there is this hardening of the neural pathways with escape routes, and it is problematic for human beings. It's problematic for human beings, you know. But it's not impossible to overcome this by any means. By any means. It just requires awareness, honesty, and a really practical, grounded approach. Okay, so that's my talk for today about psychosis. Like I said, you can also use it to begin to understand other forms of mental illness. You know, there's often, like I say, an element of avoidance in most of them. Okay, I won't repeat myself. I'm often repeating myself. Okay. Over and out, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.